Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. During his distinguished career, Robert Hormats has held numerous U.S. government positions, including ambassador and deputy trade representative. He's currently the vice chairman of Kissinger Associates in New York. Sourabh Gupta focuses on the Asia-Pacific region as resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies, right here in Washington, D.C. And Gong is a professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And John, let me start with you. This series of meetings comes at a key time for China. The economy has slowed down, as we've been reporting. Unemployment is rising. And of course, there are these trade talks that continue between the United States and China. But what did you make of the meetings that took place and what was achieved?
Certainly, I think the administration has realized the urgency of addressing these issues and have come with a slew of stimulus measures. For example, things related to reduction of taxes, things relate to the financial stimulus packages, things relate to providing more credit to small, medium-sized businesses, especially micro business. I think all these measures are very much laser focused on propping up the economy and preventing the economy from sliding down to a recession.
Robert Hormats, as Nathan King, our reporter in Beijing, told us, the Chinese National People's Congress passed a new law on foreign investment. This is what the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang had to say about that. Let's watch.
This law will also regulate government behaviors, require the administration of the government in accordance with law. And the government will also introduce a series of regulations and documents in accordance with the spirit of this law to protect the rights and interests of foreign investors.
So, Robert, to what extent does this new law go towards addressing the concerns of investors, foreign investors, that is, especially here in the United States?
Well, it certainly is a move in the right direction for American investors and investors from other countries as well. And I think what Premier Li pointed out is really the key point. And it's the same with American laws, and that is very frequently the key to the effectiveness of a law is in the regulations that are promulgated by the government to implement the law. And I think that what Premier Li mentioned, those elements of the follow-up are going to be critical. And the U.S. will be looking not just at the law, but they'll be looking at the specific regulatory follow-up. That will be the key as to how effective it is. And I think we should not attempt to rush to judgment, as some people say, well, it's too general. Laws generally of this nature are more general. It's the regulations that are important. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of consultation between the government of China and the United States and private sector companies as they develop these regulations. So that's the key. Let's give it a chance to work and not be too critical like some people in the press are too early on because of the general issue of is it too general? It may be too general in a near-term situation, but I think the specifics will be followed up in the regulations, and it probably will be a lot more specific than we've seen so far.
Robert, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the Beijing office of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, was very lukewarm in their response to what they heard at these meetings. What would they like to see, and what particularly concerns them?
Well, I think, again, they would like to see the regulations be very specific about technology transfer, what kinds of technology transfer are required, what kind of regulations are required with respect to joint venture participation, how restrictive the government of China is going to be with respect to access to China for foreign investors. Is there going to be a very dramatically reduced restrictive list? Things of that nature, and intellectual property protection in general. I've always felt that there's a great opportunity to protect intellectual property for Chinese and for Americans, because not only do Americans have intellectual property that they want protected, now Chinese are developing their own innovations, their own intellectual property. So I think in all these areas, the American Chamber and American businesses have indicated very vocally the kind of things they want. Now the moment is, I think, coming closer when they're going to see not only progress on legislation, but progress on regulations. And I think it's going to happen. It'll be key to these trade negotiations, but also key to making China more accessible to foreign investment, which creates new jobs and new opportunities for Americans and for Chinese.
Okay, joining us now is Liang. She heads the Department of Economics at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. Great to see you, Liang. Thanks for joining us. We've been talking about the meetings taking place in Beijing, the meetings known as the two sessions. We heard that there will be more spending on technology, tax cuts amounting to almost $300 billion, but no new money will be injected into the economy, nor will there be any major public spending. What did you make of the proposals that came out of the meetings?
Well, first of all, I think it's a viable policy option to focus on fiscal stimulus. So yes, the centerpiece is fiscal policy. On the tax cut part is, they try to reduce the so-called value-added tax. For manufacturing, the tax rate would go down from 16% to 13%, and for some other sectors would go down from 10% to 9%. So this is meant to, reduce the burden of enterprises by about 2 trillion Chinese yuan. So it is quite significant for the enterprises. The government did say that they are going to increase spending on high tech, especially sectors like electric cars, AI, biotech, and new materials. Actually, the Premier Li Keqiang did mention that there will be an increase in social spending on education, social programs, and public works constructions. So I think, from both spending side and tax cut, fiscal policy is going to go a long way to stimulate the economy. Although I would argue personally that fiscal package could be even larger than what it's currently planned for. Now, monetary policy is going to take a back seat, and I think that again is advisable because China does not want to go back to that debt-driven growth old model. So there's still focus on deleveraging. There will be more sort of credit easing for private, micro, and small enterprises, as the PBOC governance said, they're trying to reduce another 1 percentage point financing cost for those micro and small businesses. But there will not be a general quantitative easing. We might just see a little bit more reserve requirement cuts.
Right. Sourabh, what did you make of the proposals that came out of the meetings, and what do they tell you about China's priorities?
What they tell me about China's priorities is that China is sticking to the path that President Xi laid out at the 19th Party Congress, and then which was kind of very eloquently put forward again by Liu He in Davos, I think this was in January 2018. He talked of a key necessity, which is to transition the economy from an investment-led economy to a more sophisticated consumption-led and a more productivity-led economy. The second he talked about was a main task. The main task was supply-side structural reform, which was essentially cutting down on overcapacity. That has been pulled back a little bit this year, considering that the economy is not doing well, so they don't want to go too fast on that front. And the third that Liu He talked about were the 3 critical battles with regard to pollution, anti-poverty, and financial de-risking. They have stayed on that track and on that focus consistently, but they have taken into account that the economy is not doing well right now, and so we shouldn't push too hard on that front. So within that broader context of what Liu He and President Xi had laid out at the Party Congress, China's government work program for the next year is within that framework, but also trying to push a little bit on that fiscal side so as to give a little support to the economy.
Right. John Gong, we are aware that several years ago China took steps to become a country of innovation and embrace new technologies like AI, artificial intelligence, the green economy, including the development of electric automobiles. Premier Li has pledged higher spending on the development of these technologies. Where do you see that going?
Well, I think there's a lot of funding from various relevant government ministries as well as research institutions that will intensify the research in these areas. I think this is the key areas that the government pays a lot of attention to, especially I think in AI. But I want to talk a little bit about the electric car industry. I think this is one industry that is, from the United States perspective, is very concerned about because of its massive subsidies being provided over the years. In China, a lot of people don't know that we have over 100 automobile companies operating here. Each one of them would have a electric car program. In addition, we have about 20 what's described as new forces of automaking. These are the capital from the internet space. And over the years, there's a lot of investment in this area, and there's also a lot of subsidies. And I think it's very much to the criticism of the United States government. And I think we're starting to see that the government is scaling back these subsidy programs. For the last a few months, we've seen that some of the subsidies being scaled back. So I think it is the talk between the two governments are indeed progressing from that perspective.
Robert, we have seen this trade dispute over the last few months between the United States and China, but the United States has also gone to extreme lengths to dissuade other countries from buying technology, especially from the telecommunications company in China, Huawei, alleging that it could use its technology to spy on the United States or on U.S. allies. Premier Li did address that at the meeting. Let's listen to what he said.
You asked whether the Chinese government has asked Chinese companies to spy on information of other countries. I don't know whether you are referring to the government or the individuals of other countries, but this is not in accordance with Chinese law and is not how China does things. There is none of that now, and there will never be in the future.
So, Robert, will that go some way towards satisfying the United States, or are there still going to be big differences on this?
Well, the U.S. and China have had many, many months of debate and discussion on this issue. And I do think that the United States has been making the point that Premier Li was referring to, that China is not asking its companies to spy on other countries or other companies. A lot of American firms have made very public statements that they're concerned about this, and the U.S. government has made similar points in its various conversations and in public statements. So I think this is an issue that is going to take time to work out, and trust is going to have to be built up. And this is not going to be done overnight. It's going to take a lot of time. So building up this trust and confidence about how secrets, trade secrets are used and how they're transferred and what they're used for is not something that can be resolved in one trade negotiation between our two countries. It's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of work between Chinese and American companies to get some general sense of a common level of confidence in one another. So this is the fact that Premier Li mentioned it is a positive thing, but the steps to build this confidence are going to take some time on both sides. I also want to address one point that came up earlier, and that goes to Premier Li's point on emphasis on productivity and innovation. I gave a keynote speech at the Shenzhen High-Tech Fair a few months ago on new innovative technologies. And I did find that there is a very important point that perhaps is missed in the West and the United States, and that is China's developing its own innovation, its own technologies, its own apps in a very dramatic way. And I think there's a growing sense in China about the need to protect intellectual property that China itself is developing. So I think there's a growing constituency for protection of intellectual property in China. And that trust factor that goes into that protection is something that I think is going to develop further over time.
Right, Yan Liang, of course, we have this trade dispute that's been going on for some time. Some call it a trade war. There are also these suspicions over Huawei. But Premier Li was keen to emphasize the positive in his address to the meetings. Here he is again.
As two major economies, China and the U.S. have become closely intertwined through decades of development and cooperation. It is neither realistic nor possible to decouple the two economies. I believe we need to continue to follow the principles of cooperation instead of confrontation, mutual respect, equality, and mutual benefits to advance bilateral relations, including economic and trade ties, to deliver concrete benefits to people of the countries.
So, Yan Liang, how important is it for the United States and China to settle this trade dispute?
Well, I think it's really important for both countries. For China, it needs to have a more globally friendly environment to continue to grow, especially, to develop its homegrown technologies and innovations. And for the United States, same thing. I think their consumers would need, the low-cost Chinese products to keep their cost of living low. And the business, of course, China is the largest overseas market for them. So I think, both sides, economically, politically, socially, there are these mutual benefits to settle and, to continue with cooperation. I wanted to go back to the point that the previous speaker talked about. Yes, there is still a long way for China to enforce intellectual property rights protection, which is one of the biggest disputes in the U.S. and China trade tension. But I still think that China is moving towards the right direction. At the two sessions, some of the top judges and prosecutors talked about, last year they concluded 288,000 cases that related to intellectual property rights violations, which is a 40% increase than the previous year. They also prosecuted 8,000 some individuals for violation of intellectual property rights, which is a 16% increase than 2017. So I think China is working on improving its intellectual property rights protection, which is not only sort of yielding to the external pressure, but it's also very beneficial for China going forward, to promote homegrown innovations.
Right.
Can I also add that I agree?
Sorry, go ahead.
I very much agree with that. I think that's the point. China's moving definitely in the right direction, and they've made a lot of progress over the last several years. And I think we should take note of that in the way this conference went and in the actual actions that the Chinese government is taking to protect intellectual property. Progress is being made, definitely.
Right. If I could make one more point in terms of the trade disputes, I think another area of tension has to do with China's support, the government support for technological innovations. I think as your previous speakers talked about, Chinese government does not necessarily need to keep subsidizing directly the enterprises for innovations, but there are many things the government can do. For example, promoting education. China graduates 4.7 million STEM students last year, compared to only just about more than 500,000 in the U.S. And China has, also a lot of financial power. If you look at the venture capital, for example, by the end of 2017, China has about $243 billion venture capital. That creates a lot of financial support for innovations. So I think, the support in basic research, it's essential, and China should not cave in on the matter of supporting its own, innovations and technological progress.
Right, Sourabh, we talk about the differences between China and the United States, but China is a global player, and it wants to deepen, expand its relationship with the European Union, the countries of the EU. In fact, Premier Li said it serves the interests of both sides, and what he termed a multipolar world. So what does that tell us about what China wants to do, how it is looking beyond the relationship with the United States to expand its relationships?
What President Li is talking about, Premier Li is talking about, and what China seeks to do is have an intertwined relations with all the big major powers. The main fertile area for intertwining with the US and the EU is mainly on the economic side. That intertwining had been for the last 40 years primarily on the trade front. There is now this huge scope for intertwining on the investment, mergers and acquisitions, and in the technology sharing front. And in fact, many of the core or foundational technologies on which so much of China's innovation is based is actually produced in the West, is created in the West. And so Chinese firms would like to have the capacity to acquire those technologies or have Western firms come to a Chinese market and help Chinese inventors work with those technologies. So with the US and the EU, China is looking for an intertwined relationship in high technology, advanced manufacturing, and just technology sharing. And in that way, it can keep a tight and close relationship with these countries. And if the relations with the US obviously have a very large strategic military element, which does not happen with the EU. It doesn't happen with the EU. And therefore, if the US-China relationship goes off keel, at least the China-EU relationship can be a kind of a balancing, stabilizing mechanism.
Right, John Gong, I want to look at one other issue that was discussed at the two sessions, and that is a very important issue for China, family planning. Delegates to the Chinese parliament urged an overhaul or even a scrapping of family planning rules. They said radical steps are needed to what they termed liberate fertility. The aim, of course, is to reverse the decline in births. How big an issue is this for China?
I think to some extent it's already been happening. We've already have introduced a policy that for some families, the second child is, it's not a problem. And I think this policy is going to be broadened in the next couple of months. For some time, I think there's some political resistance within the government that this family planning policy is supported by a very extensive infrastructure, very extensive apparatus at various provincial levels, and also at the county levels, and there are a lot of people employed involved in that policy objective, and now all of a sudden these people's jobs are at stake. They need to do something else. So it's a quite painful transition for those people, and certainly you can understand there's some political resistance towards that. But I think at the end of the day, everyone realizes that we can't keep doing things like this anymore. I mean, first of all, I think China's population is going to peak and level off and start to decline. And second, I think it's something that is I'm not enamored with for a long time. So I don't think this policy is going to be continue to exist in China anymore. I think the days are numbered for its total elimination. Now, I also want to add a note to this Huawei issue. I think the Premier Li says something quite important. I think he does provide a legal interpretation to one issue that the United States government has been referring to, which is the China's intelligence law, Article 7, that says that any at a literal level, it says that any company or entity in China has obligation to cooperate with the government in terms of intelligence gathering. But I think this law, this article itself, has a legal context here. And we have a higher constitution here in China that says that we protect private companies' interests. So I think what Premier Li says is providing a legal interpretation that this article in the Intelligence Act needs to be put into context. It shouldn't be just interpreted literally. I think that's what he's talking about. So of course, the accusation against the company Huawei is totally groundless, in my opinion. I mean, there's no previous evidence at all that this company is engaging in any intelligence gathering. I mean, this company has done everything, going out of the way to open its network, to open its equipment, open its laboratories for foreign governments to inspect.
Okay, Robert, one other issue very quickly, and that is the Chinese military. Spending on the military, the People's Liberation Army, will rise to $178 billion. Now, that is a slower rise compared to previous years. What does that tell us about China's security priorities?
Well, certainly China's playing a growing role on various aspects of security. The Chinese Navy is playing a much greater global role than before. It's expanding its activities. But China is very clearly trying to underpin a broader role in the world than just military. It's not focused on military expansion. It's more focused on strengthening its economic ties, strengthening its information ties, and it's building a concentric set of circles that are really primarily focused on economic growth and economic interactivity more than the military side.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.